pertained to the Bahri dynasty. It started out as a regiment of elite slave warriors Baria under the Ayyubids but later toppled their masters. Incredibly enough, in stark contrast to near-contemporary military units like the Knights Templar, the scope of training for these early Mamluks is well documented, via their extensive Furushia, the science of martial exercise manuals. The integral part of the Mamluk martial exercise was a specified field known as the Maidan or Maidan, used as the training ground. Sultan Baybars is known to have constructed at least 2 of these huge maidans near the citadel of Cairo. These fields were known to have state-of-the-art facilities, including wells, drinking fountains, resting spaces sheltered by palm trees, water wheels, stables, and even opulent quarters for the Mamluk sultans, emirs, and their personal retinues. Interestingly enough, many of these training exercises possibly even doubled as spectator sports, given the sheer range of martial maneuvers practiced by the Mamluk soldiers. To that end, these elite slave warriors were trained in engaging with the lance from horseback, polo, archery practiced at both ground targets and high targets, fencing with swords, using heavy maces, wrestling, hunting, horse racing, and quite intriguingly shooting a special type of a blowpipe known as zabtana that discharged pellets. Such a diverse kind of training was not only for the spectators at the Maidan. They were also tailored to instill an innate nature of discipline in the new recruits, so as to maintain a continuation of Mamluk practices in both horsemanship and archery. And according to historian David Nicole and the general consensus among most researchers, it was archery from horseback that was probably the trademark of the typical Mamluk cavalryman from the 13th–14th century AD. In that regard, as opposed to shooting while moving, the Mamluk soldiers were known to have preferred shooting from a stationary position, so as to maintain higher rates of arrow volleys with precision. For example, an expert Mamluk horse archer was expected to hit a target of less than 1 meter size from a distance of 75 meters, 246 feet, and that too while shooting 3 arrows in a space of 1.5 seconds. Furthermore, some Furushia manuals also mention the use of crossbows from horseback, possibly as a substitute of the composite bow for relatively inexperienced Mamluk auxiliaries. It can be hypothesized to some degree that the Mamluk mode of horse archery, like shooting from fixed positions, was developed as a counter to the mass cavalry formations of the Mongols, rather than to the charges of the Crusader knights. To that end, the Bahri Mamluks are often credited with stopping the Mongol onslaught into the Middle East and the Levant. They defeated their agile foes at the Battle of Ain Jalut circa 1260 AD, under the leadership of Mamluk Sultan Qutuz. Interestingly enough, as a means to deal with the mobility of the Mongol army, the Mamluks might have practiced the burning of dried grasslands north of the Euphrates River, thereby denying the main source of nourishment for the enemy horse herds. The relatively stony landscape of Syria was also not suited to the unshod Mongol ponies. In contrast, the Mamluk warhorses were generally stall-fed and protected by horseshoes. Furthermore, as we mentioned before, many of the Mamluks themselves were recruited from the Kipchak and Turkic tribes that were affected or afflicted by the Mongol invasions. Thus some of them must have had a level of understanding of Mongol tactics. Moreover, after the momentous defeat of the Mongols at Ain Jalut, bands of Mongol refugees joined the Mamluk armies. Known as Wafidia, these dissident Mongol warriors were treated as free soldiers who were recruited into various regiments, as opposed to a single unit. These renegade Mongols brought forth their fair share of experience in mounted warfare and steppe tactics to the Muslim forces. And quite interestingly, the Mamluks were also known to have practiced large-scale hunting, much like the Mongols, in organized bands to effectively approach and cordon off their hunt, thereby replicating real-time battle scenarios involving mobile foes. Essentially, it was this overarching mode of maneuvering and counter-maneuvering that was perceived as an efficient tactical scope by the highly organized Mamluk forces. A Mamluk, after being selected in the elite corps of the Sultan or the senior Mamluk emirs, was presented with his first set of armor. But as he grew in rank, he was expected to acquire better armor with his improved economic means, thereby mirroring his higher status within the army. For example, the Sultan's personal Mamluks were probably equipped with the finest arms and armor, sourced from the upscale workshops situated in the largest cities of Egypt and the Levant. As for the general armor types, Furushia manuals do mention the complete kit of a fully equipped Mamluk lancer. For example, by the early 14th century, the Mamluks were required to wear the dur hauberk made of mail, while some wore a lamellar Joshin chest piece and other lamellar extensions over the mail coat for added protection. In order to achieve some form of flexibility, Mamluks may have also worn the karkal between the jashan and the dur, and it generally comprised a padded cloth often reinforced with scales. And by the late 15th century, the Mamluks began to adopt the mail and plate-type composite armor, possibly known as the Libas al-Hadid al-Munadad. As for the protection of their heads, many junior Mamluks were equipped with turban-like gear with extending reinforcements, while the senior members probably preferred their one-piece iron helmets with nasal guards. Coming to weapons, given the Mamluk lancers' versatile mode of training, they were possibly equipped with a variety of arms, ranging from lances and swords to maces. However, the characteristic weapon associated with the early Mamluks probably pertains to the powerful composite bow, which once again harks back to the influence of the Mongols as opposed to the Crusaders. This main bow type was also complemented by specialized weapons, like the aforementioned zabtan of blowpipes that were later referred to as the early Persian handguns and advanced crossbows. As can be discerned from the training modes and the variety of weapons carried by Mamluks, their tactical approach to the battle was not confined to a singular role like that of a European knight. So as opposed to just charging the enemy formations, Mamluks were also trained to feign retreats and make use of their equestrian skills to evade and maneuver the formations. The latter skill set possibly reflects their penchant for horse archery, which proved to be the bane for many ponderous Crusader armies reliant on the conventional units of infantry and cavalry. One pertinent example would relate to an encounter at Gaza in 1244 AD where a full Crusader charge was stopped by the crippling arrow shower from the mobile Mamluk positions. On the strategic level, Mamluk support played a crucial role in defeating the Seventh Crusade of King Louis IX of France in 1250 AD. Alluding to the flexibility of tactics, on some occasions, the Mamluks might have even preferred to close in with the Mongols for melee combat scenarios. In essence, they were also suited to charging the enemy lines if the situation allowed so, especially in scenarios where they could take advantage of their heavier weapons and armor to break the formations of the foe. Similarly, the Mamluks were also prepared to receive charges from the foe, thus alluding to their training-induced mentality and morale. Furthermore, according to historian Davide Nicole, some of the elite senior Mamluks could even dismount and fight on foot while also specializing in setting up defensive parameters and field fortifications. These tactical elements were complemented by raids designed to cut off enemy supplies, choosing effective battlefield locations based on the sun orientation and the wind directions, and proper use of infantry as support units, as was the case in the Battle of Ain Jalut where infantrymen chased and surrounded the beaten Mongols in the mountains. Unsurprisingly, the highest-ranked Mamluks often came from the ranks of the young slaves who were bought by the Sultan himself. These young teenagers, referred to as the Kutub students, were enrolled at the special tabaka schools for proper education, etiquette, and religious indoctrination. By the end of the schooling, the candidates were offered uniforms, horses, weapons, armor, and even a certificate. And on reaching adulthood, many of these young men were freed and recruited as the Sultan's own Mamluks, known as the Mushterawat or Jublan, which alludes to their youth. Simply put, the disciplined schooling and the strenuous training rather enhanced the esprit de corps of these Mamluks, who were designated as the loyal and almost officer-like units of the medieval Egyptian army. The Kasakia or Kasaki were the elites even within the Sultan's Mamluks, and they were chosen as the heavily armored bodyguards and the Kraks units, sometimes also selected for political duties. Interestingly enough, these young Mamluks of the present Sultan were also rivaled by the Mushtaqdaman, the Mamluks of the previous Sultans. To that end, while most of the Sultan's Mamluks were offered the choicest Iqtas lands or estates, the elite soldiers were demoted by the next ruler on the death of their patron, which created a non-hereditary system wherein the Mamluks could only be loyal to the present Sultan. On the flip side, the new Sultan often faced a dearth of experienced troops and thereby had to rely on the older Mamluks, or Karanis, for conducting the difficult campaigns, in spite of their reduced pay scale, holdings, and possibly even loyalty. Like many military fraternities, the Mamluks, in spite of coming from different regions outside the traditional borders of Islam, developed their bonds and camaraderie based on a mutual sense of loyalty to their masters. The esprit de corps was rather bolstered during the training period, and thus the groups of young men tended to form fellowships in such military schools. Interestingly enough, many of these members were often bought, trained, and released together by their masters. And so, even when they served as Mamluks, Driven by their camaraderie, the slave soldiers maintained their fraternity. Over time, much like ancient Roman contubernium tent group, the groups morphed into a brotherhood of sorts known as the Kuzdash. However, beyond just the emotional bond shared by the members, the Kuzdash was also fueled by the practicality of circumstances, including sealed agreements involving the sharing of money. Furthermore, if the master of the Kuzdash died, the entire unit, as opposed to individual Mamluks, was to be bought by a new master. Unsurprisingly, historian David Nicole compared it to 21st century businessmen who formed their own organizations. By the early 19th century, the Mamluks, while losing their crown and state, still clung to their provincial wealth. Simply put, the native Mamluks had become feudalistic in nature, boasting their rich estates and economic power. Many of these Beys chieftains even played their rebellious role in the struggle for Egyptian independence from both the Ottoman Turks and Great Britain. Wary of the rising power of this autonomous Mamluk class, Muhammad Ali Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Egypt who coincidentally later broke away from the Turkish Empire to create his own dynasty, decided to end the internal threat once and for all. So in an episode that played out like a political thriller, in 1811, Muhammad Ali invited many senior Mamluk members of the realm to his palace in Cairo, to apparently toast the start of a war with the Wahhabis in the Arabian Peninsula. Impressed by the Pasha's gesture, around 500 Mamluk Beys made their way to the capital amidst much pomp and gusto. But once they were making their way across a narrow passage near the Al-Azab gates of the citadel of Cairo, an ambush was sprung by forces loyal to Muhammad Ali. In the resultant encounter, also known as the Massacre of the Citadel, almost all the senior Mamluk leaders were slaughtered. In the following weeks, the Ottoman punitive actions claimed more lives of other Mamluks and even their family members. And while a group of Mamluks was able to flee to Dongola in Sudan, most of the members were pursued and dispersed by an Ottoman expeditionary force, thereby resulting in the total breakdown of the Mamluk power in Egypt and Syria. On an official level, Muhammad Ali may have pardoned many of these Sudan-bound Beys, but only a few of them returned to Egypt.